So that has put back the cause of peace in the Middle East, I think, for many, many years. I also think that in terms of our report here, it is not just prescribing the IRGC in its entirety, although I completely support that we have to do. We have to carry out the other recommendations that are contained in the document, namely closing the Iranian embassy here, withdrawing our diplomats from Iran, and imposing the most strongest sanctions we possibly can against the IRGC and the Iranian leadership. Because what we want to do is make sure that the ordinary Iranian people do not suffer the consequences of what has happened to because of the Iranian regime. That means that at the moment our Foreign Secretary and others in the government say, well, we've sanctioned a large number of individuals from Iran. That is not sufficient to do what we need to do. And therefore, by taking action against the IRGC, we would be taking action against the state. And of course, our friends in America have prescribed the IRGC, and therefore we are seeming to be the outlier here, as opposed to wanting to take prompt action ourselves. Now, we've got to remember that the regime in Tehran doesn't limit itself to the Middle East. It is targeting Europe in form of state terrorism. We've heard about the dreadful attack on a parliamentary colleague in relation to what has happened there, but they haven't. It's not new. They've been doing this for years, and anyone that's a critic or an opponent is at risk, whichever European capital or city you're in. They use the hostage-taking diplomacy to cover the terrorism that they inflict on the people of Europe and on Iran. Now, we know that the regime have tried to eliminate Madame Rajavi and her international Iranian supporters in Paris, but also, instead of paying the price for its unacceptable terrorism, the head of its operation now lives in freedom in Iran, possibly planning more terrorist attacks in mainland Europe against the Iranian resistance movement and those of us that support a very firm policy on Iran. Now, as Ambassador Bloomfield explained, the regime has acted through a network of experts, researchers and advisors, often of Iranian origin, who advised various branches of the US and EU governments to unduly influence their policy on Iran. The main argument here is that the regime tried to sell through its influence network that there's no alternative, so the West must reach an understanding with the regime through dialogue. The UK must move ahead and prescribe the IRGC to deny it the resources and funds it needs to export terrorism and to sustain and intensify the domestic repression. Such a decision will also make it a clear criminal offence to support and work with the IRGC in the UK, which is long overdue, and we have many agents of the IRGC operating in the UK. Also, I agree with Madame Rajavi and urge the government to work with allies and partners to place the clerical regime under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter as a threat to world peace and security. The international community must accept and acknowledge this truth so they can focus on supporting the solution, which the only solution here is the democratic alternative as presented by the NCRI and Mariam Rajavi. It then follows that the UK should lead the international community in cutting all diplomatic ties with the Iranian regime, close the embassy until such time as the regime ends its terrorism, warmongering, hostage-taking diplomacy. At this point, in my opinion, diplomacy with Tehran is more harmful than being beneficial because it hands the regime a political recognition that it neither should have or deserve. Now, contrary to the lies and deception spread by the regime's influence network, an Iranian solution and viable democratic alternative to the regime's warmongering does exist. It is the organised resistance movement with its resistance units across Iran, presented by the NCRI and Madame Rajavi. The sooner the UK recognises and endorses this Iranian popular alternative, the more effective will be our policy responses to counter the regime's warmongering and terrorism. The Iranian people and the UK have a common enemy, which is the regime in Iran. Only by cooperating with the people and their true representatives, namely the NCRI and Madam Rajavi, that we can defeat the brutal and criminal regime in Tehran.